Grazie ragazzi, welcome and benvenuto to Cannabis Sciences LinkedIn Live for this week. To those of you joining us live, thank you for being here with us today. And for those of you who will be checking out the recording at a later time, also a big thank you to you. We hope you enjoy this live and that you perhaps leave this session having learned something new. For those of you who are following Cannabis Scienza channels on LinkedIn, you probably know that in the previous events, which have been held here since more than 1 year now, we usually invite a guest who is an expert in a medical cannabis field to discuss a topic of interest. In the last two sessions, we are changing our live, making it more similar to a lesson in which we extract comments from our handbook Principle of Clinical Cannabinology, which I co-authored together with Viola Bugnatelli. But today we came back to the original format with this that is the last interview of the season. And we finish with a big bang, as we say in Italy, because today we have a great guest. Indeed, it's a pleasure and most of all an honor to host today Professor David Finn. Professor David Finn is a lot of things. He is a professor and head of pharmacology and therapeutics, principal investigator and founding co-director of the Centre for Pain Research at the University of Galway in Ireland. He's also the immediate past president of the International Cannabinoid Research Society and past president of the Irish Pain Society, among the other things. And so probably is one of the most qualified speakers for today, this session. So hi, David. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Fabio. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And so without further ado, let's start with the topic of today, that is the role of the endocannabinoid system and cannabinoid in the management of pain. Now, before going deep into the role of cannabinoids in pain, let's define a little bit what pain is. So David, I know that your research is centered on the neurobiology of pain and psychiatric disorder. So can you provide a concise definition of pain and shed light on the different types of pain we encounter?
Yes, sure, Fabio. Yes. So pain is an unpleasant sensory or emotional experience which can be associated with actual or potential tissue damage or is defined in terms of such damage. And, pain can be somewhat subjective in that we all may feel pain differently and experience pain differently. We might choose to use different words to describe the different types of pain that we feel. Probably the two main types of pain, if you kind of simplify it, are acute pain and chronic pain. Acute pain is transient and doesn't last very long. An example might be an acute headache, for example, or a toothache. Whereas an acute pain is generally relatively straightforward to manage. Some exceptions, but generally responsive to current analgesics. Whereas chronic pain is pain that persists for 3 months or longer, and usually chronic pain outlasts the precipitating injury. So the tissue injury, or may heal, and yet the individual is left in persistent pain. So this is chronic pain, and chronic pain is very difficult to treat. It's often not responsive to current analgesic drugs, for example, and it represents a major unmet clinical need globally, with at least 1 in 5 people around the world suffering from chronic pain. And so, we need to better understand chronic pain and identify novel approaches to treating it.
Okay, thank you. We also know that regarding the mechanism of pain, there are various definitions. For example, we have nociceptive pain, neuropathic pain, and so on. But
that's right.
Taking a look to your research, I see that you work with psychiatric disorder and you deal with the cognitive dimension of pain. Can you tell us something about this aspect, the cognitive dimension of pain?
Yeah, sure. So we're quite interested in the cognitive and affective dimensions of the pain experience. So we also have the sensory dimension, sensory discriminative aspect of pain. This is how we can encode what type of pain we're feeling and where we're feeling the pain and the magnitude of that pain. So that's the sensory discriminative aspect of pain. But then we also have the cognitive aspect, which is I think twofold. So how we can learn from pain that we're feeling, and pain can have some learning value and warn us of dangers and stimuli that might be harmful to us, and we learn that over time. We learn that as children, for example. But also how we can modulate pain cognitively as well. So how attention and distraction can modulate pain. And then also how chronic pain can be associated with alterations in cognitive function. For example, impaired memory function, impaired executive function, impaired attention. These have all been reported in patients with chronic pain. On the affective side, the affective or motivational dimension of pain is, I think, how pain affects our mood, and in turn how our mood and affect can modulate pain. And we know, for example, that there's a very high degree of comorbidity between chronic pain and mood disorders, with at least 50% of patients with chronic pain also suffering from anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder. And so again, the comorbidity is a major unmet clinical need, and presents a major challenge for the treatment of the chronic pain. And we know that individuals with comorbid affective disorders, their pain is more difficult to treat than individuals without the comorbid disorder.
Okay, thank you for this answer. And another very interesting aspect that probably is linked to the use of cannabinoids in pain is the fact that stress is often linked to the experience of pain. Can you tell us about this aspect, the connection between stress and pain, and how what you do with your work, your research, address these interactions?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we've got a long-standing interest in our research here in Galway, in the University of Galway, around stress-pain interactions. So the impact of stress on pain can be bidirectional. So acute stress that's an immediate threat to homeostasis, so robust stress and fear tends to suppress pain through the phenomenon of stress-induced analgesia or fear-induced analgesia. Whereas more moderate stress that's ongoing in nature, that's future-oriented, anxiety, depression, negative affect, that tends to do the opposite and exacerbate pain in the phenomenon of stress-induced hyperalgesia. There's also some dependency on the type of pain as well. So it's a complex relationship, the impact of stress on pain, either analgesia or hyperalgesia, depending on the type of stressor and also sometimes the type of pain. And we've been interested in this for some time, and also exploring the role of the endocannabinoid system in stress-pain interactions.
Okay, so regarding the role of the cannabinoids, for example, like THC or CBD in alleviating pain, can you provide some insight into the mechanisms that underlie their efficacy? Maybe starting from THC and then exploring the role of CBD?
Sure, yeah. So their mechanism of action in pain, is it? In the analgesic effects? Yeah. Sure, yeah. So most of our knowledge around the mechanisms of action of cannabinoids generally, and THC in particular in pain, comes from preclinical literature, from basic science studies in animal models, for example, and also in vitro in cells and so forth. So what we know is THC, for example, is an agonist at cannabinoid receptors, CB1 and CB2, partial agonist, and therefore it activates the cannabinoid receptors, CB1, CB2 receptors, and those receptors are expressed throughout pain pathways. So the receptors for cannabinoids are expressed on primary afferent neurons, the C fibers, for example, the delta fibers in the periphery that detect and encode noxious stimuli. The cannabinoid receptors are also expressed in the DRG and in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and they're also expressed in the brain, supraspinally, in brain regions that are important in processing and in pain modulation. The CB1 receptor in particular is very highly expressed in the brain. It's one of the most highly expressed G protein coupled receptors in the brain, in fact. The CB2 receptor has a much lower expression in the brain, but might be upregulated following injury and inflammation. So the THC then activates the cannabinoid receptors, CB1 receptors, for example, in the brain, in the spinal cord, and in the periphery. And in doing so, it reduces activity in the pain pathway. It reduces the ascending transmission of pain-related signals to the brain, and it also engages the descending inhibitory pain pathway. So we have a neuronal pathway that projects from the brain, from the midbrain and brainstem, down to the spinal cord, and this is the descending inhibitory pain pathway. And this pathway serves to inhibit pain when it's activated. And THC can activate that pathway, we think, by activating CB1 receptors on GABAergic interneurons located in brain regions such as the periaqueductal gray and the midbrain. So this is our understanding of how THC works. I think there's probably also interesting mechanisms relating to CB2 and likely
Other receptors.
anti-inflammatory effects, for example, yes, and anti-immune, suppressing immune signaling and cytokine signaling and so forth that we know also occurs after CB1 and CB2 receptor activation. CBD. Sorry.
I have just a question. But do you think that the action of the THC is just an inhibition of the connection between neurons of the neural transmission, or there is also a cognitive aspect that THC can induce? For example, it can I read that someone suggests that THC can distract people from pain. So it's not just a mechanistic action, but it's something that rely with the cognitive aspect of pain. What do you think about this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I think that there is some evidence actually that THC may also influence cognitive processing and cognitive processing relating to pain or in pain-related brain regions. There's some interesting work, for example, from Haggai Sharon and colleagues in Israel using fMRI, demonstrating impacts of THC on functional connectivity between brain regions involved in cognitive processing, and that also have an overlapping role in pain. So, I think that's a possibility and probably deserves further research. As I say, most of what we know so far does come from the preclinical evidence base, and it would be important and interesting, I think, to carry out more clinical research studies to better understand the mechanism of action of THC.
Yes, of course. And regarding CBD, we know that it acts differently from THC. For example, it does not interact, or it barely interact with the CB receptor. So can you explain us the mechanism of action of the CBD in reducing pain?
Well, I could try. I think we still
don't a little bit, yeah.
We still don't understand it fully. I would say CBD, sorry, has a very complex pharmacology. In fact, there are many different receptors that seem to be targets for CBD. It's true that it doesn't appear to activate CB1 or CB2, but it may be a negative allosteric modulator of those cannabinoid receptors. It also has some actions at the 5-HT1A receptor, for example, possibly TRPV1, PPARs, and many other receptor targets that have been shown to be targets for CBD. So it's got a very complex pharmacology. It also appears to have some potent anti-inflammatory effects, um, and perhaps relating to its effects on free radicals and inflammatory signaling. It can reduce cytokine signaling again, for example. So um, yeah, I think again CBD has been most studied in animal models in preclinical research, and there is some convincing evidence that CBD can have anti-inflammatory and analgesic, anti-nociceptive at least, actions in animal models. But there are very few high-quality clinical trials yet on CBD in pain in people. So again, I think we'd welcome more high-quality studies around CBD in human pain conditions.
Yes. Okay. And when we talk about the effect of cannabinoid, both THC and CBD on pain, we always talk about the effects on chronic pain, not on acute pain. Is it right? Can you explain briefly why there is this difference?
Um, I think again from the basic science evidence base, there's evidence that THC could have effects on acute pain. It does reduce nociceptive behavior in tests of phasic or acute pain in rodents. Um, so I wouldn't rule out an action on acute pain. Uh, in terms of chronic pain, um, I mean, obviously, that's the major unmet clinical need, and so there's a lot of focus on it. Um, the chronic pain is underpinned by plasticity in the central nervous system, and particularly central sensitization in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, probably in the brain too. And question as to whether cannabinoids can modulate or dial down some of that central sensitization. And there is some evidence, again, from basic science to suggest that maybe they can. But a challenge relating to the use of cannabinoids chronically is tolerance to the effects of cannabinoids. So there is a tolerance that develops, pharmacological tolerance that develops reasonably rapidly to CB1 receptor agonists, particularly potent CB1 receptor agonists. So that's a challenge that needs to be kept in mind. And of course, there's also the potential for adverse effects as well. Um, CB1 receptor is ubiquitous, very highly expressed and widely expressed in multiple brain regions and elsewhere throughout the body as well. So um, we're aware, of course, of the recreational use of cannabis and THC, and the potential for euphoria and psychoactive effects, some short-term memory impairment, and also potentially some dependence liability. So all of these are, you know, um, are of some concern in the context of the use of cannabis or cannabinoids for the treatment of chronic pain, because the drugs would need to be taken chronically. Um, that's not to say that some of those concerns couldn't be alleviated or overcome with the right approach, with the right dosing strategies, with route of administration. I think is important, um, and obviously selection of the right patients as well.
Yes. Moreover, regarding side effects, there are several studies that affirm that probably by using the whole medical cannabis, the so-called phytocomplex, we can reduce the side effects. According to you, do you think it's better to use single cannabinoids or the whole medical cannabis, depending, of course, on the kind of patients we are treating?
Yeah, that's another really interesting question, Fabio. And again, I think it deserves more research, because I don't think we have a definitive answer to that one yet, unfortunately. Um, I, 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 I I mean, I would like ideally to see single molecule cannabinoids developed for clinical use, and there you've got sort of pharmacological selectivity, potentially cleaner outcomes relating to adverse effects, and just a more solid knowledge underpinning the pharmacological action of what's being administered. So single molecule drugs are more attractive to me as a pharmacologist, but that's proven difficult so far in terms of cannabinoids or the endocannabinoid system modulators for pain. I think there's a lot of interesting work, ongoing, and there has been interesting work published in the past around FA inhibitors and manglipase inhibitors and selective CB2 agonists and other ways of subtly modulating the endocannabinoid system. So I'm supportive of all those approaches. I think they're really interesting and deserve more research. But I guess the bottom line is we don't yet have those for pain. There are some approved cannabinoid drugs now on the market for other conditions, like CBD for childhood epilepsy and nabilone and tranabolon and so forth for other conditions, but not quite yet for pain. So, and yet what we know is from patients and from cohort, from registries and population health studies and some limited RCT evidence is that people who use cannabis do sometimes find that it helps with their pain. So, as to whether that's driven primarily by THC and CBD, or whether there's an entourage effect relating to the other components in cannabis, I think that just needs more study. That there is some interesting evidence, coming to light around potential analgesic effects of other constituents in cannabis. For example, the terpenes, terpenoids appear to have some antinociceptive activity in animals models, and so I think that's interesting, and also some suggestion that CBD in conjunction with THC may reduce some of the psychoactive effects and side effects of THC, which I also think is interesting.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I also agree with you that we need more study on this aspect to provide more evidence on which cannabinoid, which dose regimen are more efficient to treat patient with pain, with various kind of pain. And regarding research and studies, what are and your researches and your studies, what are some of the most recent development or key findings from your research regarding the use of cannabinoids in pain management?
Yeah. So one of the things we've been quite interested in is around the role of the endocannabinoid system and the endocannabinoids in stress-induced analgesia. We study a particular form of this called fear-induced analgesia, and we've shown that the endocannabinoid system is very important in mediating this form of endogenous analgesia. So when we block CB1 receptors, for example, pharmacologically, we can abolish the stress-induced analgesia response in rodents, and when we augment endocannabinoid signaling, we can enhance fear-conditioned analgesia response, fear-induced analgesia response. So I think some of our work has shown that the endocannabinoid system, the endocannabinoid signaling, is really quite important for endogenous analgesia, and we've pinpointed some of the brain regions that are important for this endocannabinoid-mediated stress-induced analgesia, including the midbrain periaqueductal gray, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, ventral hippocampus. So that's been interesting for us. We also have been working on the converse, which is how anxiety and depression related phenomena can exacerbate pain, and again using rodent models to model this, and we found that we can show a hypersensitivity to pain in the Worcester-Kyoto strain, which also shows an anxiety and depressive phenotype, and then that phenotype is associated with impaired endocannabinoid signaling in the brainstem and in the rostroventral median medulla. So that's been interesting for us too. We're currently progressing research on multiple fronts. I suppose we have an interest in the anti-inflammatory effects of cannabinoids as well, and we've shown in papers over the years that that cannabinoids can reduce mitogen-induced stimulation of cytokine expression and release, for example, in the brain and in the periphery. So that's, I think, quite interesting in this potential mechanism for how cannabinoids may exert their analgesic effects through reducing inflammatory signaling, cytokine signaling. And then currently we're also doing more clinical research in patient cohorts, measuring endocannabinoid levels and asking the question as to whether endocannabinoid levels or a profile of endocannabinoids may be a useful biomarker to predict pain outcomes and to predict transition from acute to chronic pain, for example.
This is very interesting because I think that what we are talking about since now it's the role of exogenous cannabinoid on pain, but probably the endocannabinoid system have a slightly different role in pain because we know that physiologically the members of the endocannabinoid system, especially the endocannabinoids, are produced on demand and on specific brain region. So maybe their role in pain is slightly different for what exogenous cannabinoid can teach us from research. So it's very important to understand this, especially to dose the cannabinoids. I know that it's not easy because it's there are a lot of variables between people regarding the quantity of endocannabinoids. Did you find some average level that can be like a threshold to understand if there is a modification of the endocannabinoid tone regarding pain or also other conditions?
Yeah, so in all of our studies, we also have control participants who do not have chronic pain conditions. So, we're comparing the levels in patient cohorts with those healthy age and sex matched controls, and yes, we are finding that there are differences in the levels of endocannabinoids between patients with chronic pain versus healthy controls. The precise nature and direction of that difference depends on which analyte we analyze, and also on the pain condition, and with some sex dependency as well. So it's complex, and we're still trying to understand and interpret those data.
Okay, thank you. We are approaching to the end of this live, so maybe just one last question for you. What are the advancement that you see in this field of research? Do you think is something we are missing regarding the role of cannabinoids in pain, and what will be the future direction of the studies in this around this subject?
Yeah, great question, and hard one to answer quickly. But I basically, I suppose I feel we should progress research on multiple fronts. We need more research. We need to better understand the role of the endocannabinoid system in pain. We know quite a lot, and since the system was discovered. And it's a relatively recently discovered system, but certainly there's plenty of scope to understand the system and its role in pain more thoroughly and more comprehensively. So I think we need the basic science research to continue better understanding the endocannabinoid system and its role in pain, and particularly its role in these comorbidities of anxiety, depression, cognitive impairment with pain. So that would be the first thing. And secondly, I think we need also to progress clinical research, clinical trials that are focused both on individual single molecule cannabinoids and modulators of the endocannabinoid system, but also with cannabis as well, because the reality is it's being used by patients in many countries now legally, but in other countries not legal still, and there are questions and controversies around this use, relating to efficacy and relating to harms and potential adverse effects. And so, we do need more research to try and get to the bottom of that and clarify whether cannabis itself is effective and what types of chronic pain it may be effective for, and what types of chronic pain it might not be effective for, and what type of patients, and whether there are harms and what those harms are. That we conflate the recreational use of cannabis, I think, too often with the medical use, and we should separate the two. The harms may be quite different in those different contexts. The harms relating to cannabis use under medical supervision with relatively low THC content are likely to be quite different than harms relating to recreational use with much higher percentages of THC, for example. So we need to appreciate these nuances and try and conduct high quality research, which I think will involve RCTs, yes, but probably also we need to look beyond RCTs, because RCTs, I think, are challenging in this space for multiple reasons, and so we should also stay open to other types of evidence, I think, including population health studies, registries, and N-of-1 studies, and other forms of evidence.
Yes, probably also the so-called real-world evidence can help in this way. Okay, David, thank you for being with us today. It has been really a pleasure. We are up to the end of this live, so thank you to all our audience, and see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.